this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is all about how to build a passage map. It's a really important skill in reading comprehension so that you can focus on the big picture and get the main thrust of the passage without getting bogged down in the details. So in today's lesson, we essentially just need to do two things. First, find the main point and then describe the purpose of the rest of the information in relation to that main point. Let's start by just a brief overview of the reading comprehension process and talk about how the passage map fits into this. So essentially, creating a passage map is one step in the four-step process that you're going to want to use whenever you're working on reading comprehension. So the first step in that process is to make sure that you're actively engaged in the reading process, that you want to make sure that you're connecting with information so that you can personally relate to it in some way or another. That allows you to draw some significance from the information. It allows you to retain that information and comprehend it better because there's now a reason why you should care because you've connected to it. So whether it's a class that you took last quarter or whether it's a personal experience that you might have, if there's any way in which you can connect to the information in the passage, that'll greatly increase your retention and comprehension of the passage. And then second, you want to make sure that as you're going through this passage, you're anticipating where the passage is going to go so that every once in a while you stop, you think about what you've just read, make sure that it makes sense to you, and guess where might this passage go from here? Because after a while of seeing these passages again and again, you start to realize that they only have a certain number of templates that they follow. So maybe you're given some kind of a problem that's being described in the first paragraph. It doesn't take much time before you start to realize, well, maybe I'm going to get a solution to the problem at some point, or maybe I'm going to get reasons why I should care about the problem, or a history of how the problem came to be. There's a certain number of things that they can do based off of what you've been reading. And so if you can start to anticipate where the passage is going to go, what that does, it's not that you care about whether you're right or wrong with your anticipation. It keeps you actively engaged in the reading process, and again, increases your retention and comprehension of the passage. So after you've finished reading the passage, you need to do a couple of things before you move on to the questions. It's just like you wouldn't go into the questions in a logic game after reading through the information. No, you're going to create a game board. You're going to set up the game. You're going to notate the rules. You're going to make any inferences that you can. And then once you've organized the information in a clear way, then you're going to go into the questions. Well, the same is going to happen in reading comprehension. And it's not a bad idea to think of the process that you take in reading comprehension as somewhat similar to the process you take in logic games. So after you get done reading the passage, you want to stop, make sure you can identify the main point of the passage. Then what is the purpose of each of the paragraphs in relation to that main point? So what is it doing in service of getting to that main point? And then after you've got a good passage map, then you can move on to the questions. And that whole process, finding the main point and conducting a passage map, should be about 30 or 40 seconds. It doesn't need to be very long. It just needs to be that you've got a bird's eye overview of how the passage is organized and you know what the main thrust of the passage is all about. So here's a passage. Go ahead and take a second and read through this one on your own. And when you're ready, hit play again. We'll come back and I'll show you how I go about finding the main idea and conducting a passage map. So in this passage, we're essentially given two different views. In the first paragraph, it introduces the first view, which is the traditional view. And that traditional view defines both multipolar and bipolar systems, which is the discussion presented in the first and second paragraphs. In that third paragraph, we get a pivot word that allows us to see that we're moving away from the opposing point and towards the author's point, which is the word however. So in terms of trying to figure out what's the main idea here, it's going to belong to the author, and it's being introduced at the beginning of the third paragraph. And so the main idea is in lines 34 to 37 that the shift in the geopolitical landscape following the end of the Cold War calls for a reassessment of the assumptions underlying these two theoretical concepts. So the two theoretical concepts are multipolar systems and bipolar systems. They're elaborated on in the first paragraph and the second paragraph. And then the author is basically saying we need to reassess the assumptions underlying those theoretical concepts. So we've got the main idea, which is the beginning of the third paragraph, and now we needed to think about the purpose of each of the remaining paragraphs, the other parts of the passage. So what's happening in that first paragraph? Well, we're getting the traditional view held by social scientists. And that traditional view is essentially twofold. We have both, the multipolar systems described in the first paragraph and the bipolar systems described in the second paragraph. Then we get into the main idea. The author then goes on in the last paragraph, says this reassessment may also lead us to look at the Cold War in a new light. So what that's telling us is that there is not only a reassessment that is being called for, but that reassessment may have an implication, and it may lead us to look at the Cold War in a different way. So there's an implication of the author's main idea described in the fourth paragraph. And essentially, that's the purpose of each of these paragraphs, right? The first paragraph is to give us half of the opposing point or the traditional view. The second paragraph is to give us the other half of the traditional view. The third paragraph gives us the author's main idea, and then the fourth paragraph gives us an implication of the author's main idea. So now that we know what the main idea is and the purpose of each of the paragraphs, we're ready to answer the questions. And that's essentially the process that you want to take on reading comprehension each and every time. So let's look at one question. It's the main point question from that passage. Go ahead and give this one a try on your own. When you think you've got an answer that you like, hit play, come back, and we'll work through it together. All right, so we're looking for the main idea. When you have a question like this, you simply want to go back to the passage, reread the main idea, and then use that as your anchor as you're reading through the answer choices. So we're essentially looking for an answer choice that paraphrases the idea that the shift in the geopolitical landscape following the end of the Cold War calls for a reassessment of the assumptions underlying these two theoretical concepts. If we look at answer choice A, it says that peace can be maintained in Europe only if a new bipolar system emerges. This is not restating that idea. That's simply an unsupported relationship. And you can see that with the degree in there as well, with the words only if. Like, that's building a relationship that was never being described in the passage. If you look at answer choice B, it says that all kinds of international systems discussed by social scientists carry within themselves the seeds of their own collapse and ultimately endanger international order. So all kinds of international systems discussed by... This doesn't talk about anything related to a reassessment of a traditional view. Let's get rid of it. It's simply out of scope. Answer choice C says that current European geopolitical landscape is a multipolar system that strongly resembles the concert of Europe, which existed through most of the 19th century. This may be true, but it's definitely not the main idea. It's a point taken from the passage and presented, but it's not the main idea. It's simply too narrow. We're simply looking for a call for a reassessment of that traditional view. Answer choice D says that multipolarity fostered the conditions that led to World War II and is incompatible with a stable modern Europe. Again, this does not represent the idea that there's a reassessment that's needed. It's simply taking a point that was made in the passage and regurgitating it, but it's simply too narrow to be the main idea. So hopefully answer choice E looks good. It says that the characterization of multipolar systems as stable and bipolar systems as open to debilitating conflict needs to be reconsidered. That sounds like reassessed in light of the realities of post-Cold War Europe. That is our main idea. Answer choice E. And we can support that in lines 34 to 37. So now let's try another one. Go ahead and give this passage a try. Read through it and see if you can find the main idea of the passage and determine what's the purpose of each of the paragraphs in this passage. And when you're ready to discuss, hit play again, and we'll work it through together. All right, welcome back. So now there are two places that people typically point to when they're trying to find the main idea on this passage. And those two places are the beginning of the second paragraph and the beginning of the third paragraph. We have the pivot word, but, that tells us that we're moving away from an opposing point that was previously stated. And in this case, it's stated right before, at the end of the first paragraph. Right? Those critics, they're recommending something, right? That they're recommending that we reduce the verdict requirement to something less than unanimity. The author disagrees with that. The author says that, but the material costs of hung juries do not warrant losing the benefit. So we have the opposing point stated in the end of the first paragraph. And then we have that pivot towards the author's point of view, which continues for the rest of the passage. And then we have these two tempting ideas for which one represents the main idea. Now, to figure out which one is the author's main point, we want to look to see whether one of them can fit within the other. So notice that the beginning of the third paragraph talks about the benefit of maintaining the unanimous verdict requirement, and that it's much more likely that the trial will be fair. And in the beginning of the second paragraph, it talks about that benefit. It says the material costs of hung juries, which were listed in the previous paragraph, that was the criticism against the unanimous verdict, is that they're a costly relic. So the author is saying that the material costs of hung juries do not warrant losing the benefit. And that benefit is pointing out, at a future point, the idea that's being discussed in the third paragraph, which is the idea that that those trials will be fair. So because the beginning of the third paragraph fits within the idea presented at the beginning of the second paragraph, we can say that the beginning of the second paragraph is the author's overall main point, and that the beginning of the third paragraph simply represents an intermediate conclusion along the way. So we got the main point at the beginning of the second paragraph, and now we can think about the purpose of the remaining paragraphs, although we've already got a pretty good start on the first paragraph. They're introducing this thing called the unanimous verdict requirement, and then there's a criticism made about it. So essentially we have the opposing point stated in the first paragraph, then the main point stated in the second paragraph. So if we want to go a little deeper on the second paragraph, in the next sentence it says that statistically jury trials are relatively rare. Right? Why would the author bring up the fact that they're rare? Well, the author is trying to address the concern of the critics, which is that they're a costly relic. But if they're costly and don't happen very often, the author is essentially minimizing that drawback, and then goes on to discuss the pros in the next paragraph. So we have in the second paragraph a minimization of the critics' concern. Right? They're costly, but they don't happen very often. And then in the third paragraph, we get the benefit that the unanimous verdict requirement brings. So we can basically say we got the opposing point, the main point, minimization of the critics' concern, and then a discussion of the benefits of unanimity. Now that we have the organization of the passage, we're ready to answer the questions. So remember, the process on reading comprehension is essentially just to read the passage, make sure that you're actively engaged in that reading process, so anticipating where the passage is going to go, trying to connect personally as much as you can to the information. Both of those things will help you retain information and comprehend it better. Then identify the main point and try not to get into the habit of interpreting the main idea. You really want to, as much as possible, find the main idea within the statements that are made, because it will reduce the risk that you're going to allow that main idea to shift once you get to that main point question. That you can simply come back to the main idea within the passage, reread it, and then use that as the anchor as you're answering the main point question. And then think about the purpose of each of the paragraphs, which is essentially creating a passage map. And then once you have that complete, you're ready for the questions. So how do you find the main point? Well, you're looking for places that represent the author's perspective, possibly even giving some kind of a judgment or preference. Maybe you see the word should or ought. You ought to do that, or something is more important than something else. Places where you see judgment are a good place to look for the main idea. If you see assertions that are not attributed to others, again, that tells you that you're looking at the author's view. And then maybe you see some words that give you a positive or negative viewpoint on something. Or you might even be able to use language cues like thus or since to help you find the main idea of the passage. So to create a passage map, you first find that main point, and then what you want to do is relate each of the paragraphs back to that main point and describe what that paragraph does in service of getting to that main point. And it's important that you focus on purpose rather than content. So if you have to think about how do I want to describe this paragraph, describe it more in the genre of what it's accomplishing than on what it's saying. So that's it for today's lesson on how to build a passage map. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.